Welcome to the New America Foundation. My name is Peter Bergen. We're going to have a presentation today by Chris Rogers of CIVIC, CIVIC is the Campaign for Innocent Victims in Conflict. It was founded by actually an old friend of mine, Marla Ruzicka, who was killed in Iraq in 2005. So it's great to have CIVIC here. Thank you, Sarah. And Chris has spent at least a year in Pakistan researching the issue of civilian casualties. And so he's going to present the findings of his report, and then we'll throw it open to questions and answers. If you do ask a question, if you could identify yourself and ask a question rather than making a statement, that would be helpful. Thanks. Chris.
Hello, hi, thank you very much, Peter, and thank you to Andrew and others here at New America for inviting me to speak. As Peter mentioned, I've been working in Pakistan for the past year or so, conducting interviews with civilian victims from all over the country. Over 160 interviews we've conducted with victims who suffered direct losses as a result of the conflict, meaning persons who had either lost a family member, been seriously injured themselves, or lost a home as a direct result of the fighting there. So first I'd like to just briefly outline a couple of our findings, and then I'd like to comment on some of the implications of our report for U.S. strategic and security interests there. So firstly, I think one finding I think is quite surprising is that civilian casualties in Pakistan are actually greater than those in Afghanistan. There have been over 2,100 civilian deaths in 2009 from terrorism alone in Pakistan, by somewhat conservative estimates. In Afghanistan, by contrast, there were slightly more than 2,400 deaths from all conflict-related violence. So with just over 2,100 in Pakistan from terrorism, this figure doesn't include what we found, which is a great number of civilian casualties from Pakistani military operations, particularly the use of air power, artillery, etc., as well as drone strikes and other forms of conflict-related violence. Second, I think we found that it's almost certain that U.S. drone strikes are causing more civilian casualties than the U.S. has admitted thus far. The U.S. claims that only this year, 10 non-combatants, or less than 10 non-combatants, have been killed, none of which occurred in the most recent upsurge in violence this past month. And they've claimed, or officials have claimed, that 20 or around 20 were killed from January 2009 through March 2010. In 9 cases that we investigated, primarily in North Waziristan, we found 30 civilian deaths, 14 of whom were women and children, just in those 9 cases alone. One case in particular was quite interesting. It was actually the first strike of the Obama administration. 3 days after President Obama was sworn in on January 20th, a missile hit a house in South Waziristan, and it ended up being not that of a Taliban member, but of a pro-government peace committee member. We also got from the Pakistani government, or from connections with the government, documentation issued by what's called the assistant political agent of South Waziristan, attesting to those deaths as well as the cause and effectively the civilian status of those involved. A report also contains testimonials and interviews from victims themselves, which I think is something somewhat new to the conversation. Those we interviewed opposed the drone strikes, probably not too much of a surprise. But I do think that their views were actually a bit more nuanced than I think much of the drone debate tends to suggest. Many acknowledged that the drones were somewhat accurate in hitting the Taliban, but they insisted that civilians were nonetheless still being caught up in strikes, many instances of not just erroneous information that resulted in targeting, but say a militant's car passing by a house, and the blast actually destroys part of the house, and people are killed in these incidents as well. And so even given the accuracy, civilians were clearly still being caught up in strikes. Victims also talked about how they didn't believe that the strikes were effective in the long term. So it's not just about the accuracy with respect to hitting militants versus civilians, but many commented that they didn't believe that, essentially from their perspective, it was making their lives more secure. The way one woman put it, she said that after 2 years of increasing drone strikes, I don't have less militants around me, I only have more. And I think that was a view that was shared by others, that people don't feel from their perspective, where they live, more secure, they feel less. Third, civilians that we spoke to hold warring parties responsible and expect amends or some form of help for how they've suffered. Losses obviously hit families hard, and many are struggling with poverty and displacement on top of losses caused by the conflict. Underlying socioeconomic conditions, particularly social and economic vulnerability, greatly magnify the harm suffered by victims and make long-term recovery incredibly difficult for people. Interviewees uniformly demanded compensation or assistance in helping recover from their losses. Indeed, our interviews showed that compensation programs were quite effective at mitigating anger and I think critically enhancing the perceived legitimacy of the Pakistani military and the government. Somewhat encouragingly, compensation programs actually do exist in Pakistan, though there are very significant gaps and deficiencies that prevent help from getting to most victims. The Pakistani government has compensation programs administered on the local level, both for terrorism victims as well as for civilian casualties caused by its own military operations. They provide compensation in the form of cash for deaths and injuries, both in KPK as well as FATA, and also for housing destruction. We found, for instance, that over 2,000 deaths have been compensated by the government in recent years, both from, again, terrorism as well as collateral damage in military operations. But the gaps are significant. None of those we interviewed from FATA had received any compensation. None of those injured had received compensation. And also, I think important to note, none of those who were injured or killed in drone strikes received any compensation. So I think there are compelling strategic reasons to address civilian losses. Defeating militancy in Pakistan, I believe, requires first and foremost building the legitimacy of the Pakistani government, particularly in FATA and other conflict areas. In many ways, this is principally Pakistan's war, and the key goal of winning hearts and minds is winning hearts and minds in support of the Pakistani's own government. The U.S. has already dedicated itself to this mission, to this objective, through billions in aid in the form of Kerry Lugar and other military and non-military assistance, much of it aimed at building the capacity and legitimacy of the Pakistani government vis-a-vis their people and addressing underlying grievances and drivers of the conflict. Addressing civilian harm is a necessary part of this approach. It provides meaningful help for those in need, extends the control and capacity of the Pakistani state into conflict areas, it addresses real grievances, and enhances the legitimacy of the Pakistani government in the eyes of its people. Left unaddressed, as our interviews show, civilian harm provokes anger and resentment, undermines support for Pakistani military operations, and facilitates militant recruitment. I think there are also important second-order effects to consider, such as the willingness of civilians to provide intelligence, buy into local government institutions, and cooperate with local officials on development and political projects and programs. In the long term, stability and security requires extending the state and governance structures into areas like FATA, which will require buy-in and support from local people, and without that, on-the-ground change is impossible. Finally, to return to the issue of drone strikes, the U.S. and Pakistan, we believe, both have an obligation to come clean on drone strikes. Both countries need to explain the basis for targeting, how many civilians are killed and injured, as well as Pakistani involvement and level of cooperation with the United States. Transparency and accountability is also critical, but not only from the perspective of the public and leaders in the United States, also from victims on the ground, many of whom have no acknowledgement of their harm or recognition, and no one to answer why they've suffered the harm they have. We also must appreciate the precedential nature of drone strikes in Pakistan. The same arguments and justifications, or lack thereof, used by Pakistan and the United States will be duplicated and exploited by countries around the world, especially in particular concern as drone technology continues to proliferate. In conclusion, I'd like to emphasize, 3 points. First, civilian casualties in Pakistan are a serious problem. the U.S. is very likely underestimating the number of casualties from drone strikes, and not fully appreciating the ripple effects caused in these affected areas. The Pakistani military, for its part, has done little to acknowledge the extent of civilian losses caused by its own operations, and in some cases has actively sought to suppress and criticize such information. Second, the perceived legitimacy of the Pakistani state in conflict areas is key to lasting stability and security. State control and institutions must have buy-in and support from local leaders and individuals, and civilian casualties, especially when left unaddressed, cause serious harm to these efforts. Finally, looking forward in Pakistan, the prospects for finding solutions is somewhat encouraging. Though many, even in Pakistan and the international community, aren't aware, the Pakistan government has already committed itself to compensation programs and addressing civilian harm. Yet these programs are ad hoc and underfunded, and significant gaps remain, particularly with respect to victims in Fatah, as well as victims of U.S. drone strikes. With billions of aid pouring in, addressing this issue requires proportionally or relatively few resources, yet would yield significant strategic gains both for the United States and for Pakistan. With support from the United States and the international community, as well as more attention to these issues within Pakistan itself, real reforms are very possible, which can not only provide and help victims with redress, but will improve state capacity and contact in affected areas, address real grievances contributing to the conflict, help open space for the extension of the Pakistani political and development efforts, and critically extend the legitimacy, or the perceived legitimacy, of the Pakistani government and military. Thank you.
Ask you, one of the things that we found is that we conducted the first independent poll in Fatah on the issue of drones, and we found that 3/4 of Fatah residents opposed the drones, but if they were operated by the Pakistanis, opposition became about 50-50. So that, and the Pakistanis, as you know, you mentioned that a number of countries have their own drone programs. Pakistan has its own drone program, and I really endorse what you said about this. This is the world's worst kept secret, the drone program. Why, if it's really the case as the American government claims that the civilian casualty rate from drones is now down to 2%, why don't we just come clean about it? Everybody knows that we're responsible for the drones, and if there's a good story to tell, which American officials claim, why not just be more transparent about it? The era of plausible deniability for the Pakistani government, I think, is, and for the American government, is long come and gone.
Yeah, sure. So, on the poll and on the polling data, which I think was fantastic that came out, and something that provides very important insights, because I think, particularly in Fatah, I mean, this is really a black hole of information, and there's very little, firstly, information, very little ability to get into these areas and to get good information, and so it's very important in that respect. I think also the opposition to the strikes generally, resonated with or accorded with what we found when talking to victims. Obviously, it was a different sort of sample of people. And we looked at sort of cases as opposed to something that was rather statistical, but it did seem to be consistent. On the let me just say about just one more thing about the polling, though. I do think it's I'd be interested in hearing, actually, you might respond to this, but I find it difficult to know what kind of samples should matter in this respect, right? So we spoke with victims, people basically in the affected areas, meaning North Waziristan and South Waziristan. The vast majority of the strikes, I mean, if not every one, especially at this point, are occurring in those two areas, and even that, on like 90% in North Waziristan at this point. And I'd be interested to know, but it seems to me a lot of the polling data came from Fatah as a whole.
We actually drilled down agency by agency, and
Okay.
we haven't released the data yet, but unsurprisingly, North Waziristan, where all the drone attacks are now happening, is the most hostile. I mean, because there was an unscientific survey by a group called Ariana out of Peshawar. There's a big difference between a poll and a survey. A survey, if I go to my house in 1501 R Street in Northwest and ask people, what do you think of Obama? 98% of people are going to say Obama is great. That's a survey. A poll is a scientifically, demographically sampled way of telling what people really think. And people are overwhelmingly opposed to these, particularly in the areas where they're happening. So, I mean, it's interesting that you found that yourself from anecdotally.
Absolutely. But again, I think also as the poll gets into, I mean, especially as you go through it, I think it suggests that, views are more nuanced and more complex. As you mentioned, for instance, when you ask people if the Pakistanis were carrying out these strikes, that actually changes people's response and reaction. Now, it doesn't mean people are overwhelmingly in favor of them, but it changes people's response. And so, on the subject of why the United States just doesn't come clean, particularly when they seem to have the civilian casualty argument, at least on their side, I think, well, there's obviously other reasons why they're not, right? I think those principally lie within the Pakistani government, that at this point, the U.S. doesn't gain a lot from coming clean, particularly when its partner, the Pakistani government, gains a lot from the duplicity that they're able to maintain, which, again, is surprising, particularly, from this perspective, because, as you mentioned, it's the worst-kept secret in the world. I mean, the very, very thin veneer of deniability that still at this point exists. But I will say perhaps in Pakistan, particularly amongst the general public, that deniability, at least in the perception of some of the powerful within the Pakistani government, still believes that it has some traction. And so I think that's one of the reasons why there's still no movement on the covert nature of it.
Just one final question before we throw it open to to the audience. The Pakistani military, when it does these large-scale military operations, effectively tells civilians to leave the affected area. So when the SWAT operation happened, at least 1 million people moved out of SWAT, and the Pakistani military then conducted a pretty effective, I think, although not to American counterinsurgency standards, military operation, which was pretty damaging to the Taliban. And then the population really came back. And SWAT is, it's back in business, as it were, the big towns in SWAT. So did you consider when you were reporting the efficacy of this kind of, large scale? It's not something the Americans can do in Afghanistan, tell Kandaharis to leave Kandahar. That's not going to happen. But clearly Pakistani, the military in their own country can do it. And do you think that reduced, and was it helpful to have the civilians out of the military area of operation?
I think that, just as a sort of a mathematical matter, that has to contribute in some respect. The number of targets and potential for particularly incidental sort of damage, particularly to people themselves. If most people have left, it's going to be much lower. So I think that does make sense. One problem, however, is that, it's very difficult to get information, even what civilian casualties did occur during these operations and what the causes were. We have some numbers that came from the Pakistani government, but the breakdown is a bit unclear, and I think that, a lot of people came knocking for these numbers and didn't get them, so it's not like they're publicized in a very easy way. So I think it's the first problem in assessing how effective a strategy like that is to know, what the real numbers are and how many civilians are being affected and where they're going and so forth. And I'd also qualify it by saying that, a lot of people, and many people did leave, but a lot of people didn't. A lot of people stayed for a variety of reasons. I met people who stayed because they want to look after their house. The same reason the United States, the hurricane's bearing down on Florida and you don't leave because you want to take care of your stuff and you think you'll weather the storm, and people had the same mentality there, and so they stayed. And then once it starts, they're stuck. And then there's curfews, and so they can't get out, and they try and they get shot, and things like this happen. People were injured, or not injured, but sick, and they couldn't move, or they were with someone who was sick, elderly, couldn't move. Also, there's an intense distrust, at least among some people in some portion of the population. They didn't believe that they'd be taken care of if they left. Where would they go? 90% of the people and SWAT didn't stay in IDP camps. They were in displaced communities and relying on other people. And so it's not as if they were told to leave and then there was, huge government services in camps waiting to take care of them. This was not the situation. And so I think that puts people in a very, very difficult position. So whilst there likely is some strategic gains, with respect to civilian casualties from a tactic like that, it also, firstly, there's people who still are suffering, and secondly, there are all sorts of ramifications for the people who do leave, and how do they survive? So,
Arnaud de Bourgegrave.
Thank you. As a journalist, I've covered 18 wars over a 30-year period. We've had about 200 conflicts since the end of World War II. And without exception, far more civilians got killed than military. And what's quite remarkable about what you've told us today is how few civilians are getting killed compared to what we've seen since World War II.
I guess in a follow-up to that, the numbers that you quoted, the Pakistani population is 6 times larger than the Afghan population. So, it's not apples and oranges.
Yeah. I guess on the first point about, how these numbers might compare to other conflicts, particularly nearer to World War II, I guess one can, from that, deduce that there's been progress, right? From World War II, we got things like the Geneva Conventions and international humanitarian law. These were norms that we generally believed were sort of inculcated in militaries and societies, and so conflict also changed for a variety of security and geopolitical reasons since then. But aside from that, I think that there were real normative advances made in the wake of World War II that I think have contributed to a decline in civilian casualties. I think that, first of all, doesn't mean there's still not a very large problem now that we can be aware of and try to address. And secondly, I think it should be heartening that those sort of efforts succeeded as they did, and then we should ask ourselves, I think, which is what CIVIC is trying to do, what are the new norms that need to take us forward even more? On the subject of,
the comparison to Afghanistan is not really...
absolutely. Obviously the population of Pakistan is much larger, but the affected area of Pakistan is very small. Right, especially population-wise. The vast majority of the Pakistani population lives in Sindh and Punjab. We're talking about primarily, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and NWFP in the northwest, and FATA, which are, compared to those areas, less densely populated, and so there's just less people. So I think, I actually think it would be apples and oranges if we did the comparison by making it a ratio of what the country size looked like. Because if you looked at the affected area, you're actually not talking about that many people, yet there's an incredible amount of violence going on in that area and infecting an incredible amount of people very acutely.
That's a very good point. And in fact, in Urdu, Fatah is referred to as foreign area. So most Pakistanis don't see it as part of Pakistan.
Yeah, which is,
And I forgot to mention that Chris is a 2009 graduate of Harvard Law School. As you can tell, he's a very adept explicator of these issues. Go ahead.
Taha Gaya with the Pakistani American Leadership Center. Just from the outside, it seems like if there was a Pakistani military operation in Waziristan, that would actually cause more civilian casualties than the drone strikes currently do. Mm-hmm. So is the perception within Pakistan that if something like that were to happen, that there would be actually less civilian casualties than caused by the drone strikes? Or does it have to do with a Pakistani military operation having kind of holding power that you talked about, or kind of enforcing the state? And my second question has to do with when you talk to, I guess, U.S. military commanders and those sorts of things, what specific mechanism for compensation do you recommend? Do you recommend that the U.S. pays the money to the Pakistani military and the Pakistani military then compensates for victims of drone strikes? Or what does that specific compensation mechanism look like when you propose it? And the third thing just has to do generally with advocacy. What kinds of advocacy are you doing? What is the response that you get when you meet with, CENTCOM or whoever is now in charge with Petraeus and his advisors? Because we've actually met with the Department of Defense on this specific issue, and they've kind of told us, well, for reasons of national security, these are ongoing military operations, we can't comment on them, but we'll hear your concerns. So what kind of response have you been getting to the kinds of mechanisms that you propose specifically on these sorts of things? Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. So on Pakistani military operations in North Waziristan, I take it you mean you're comparing what the anticipated civilian casualties would be if you had a full-fledged Pakistani military operation versus the current policy of drone strikes, basically, right? Yeah. I mean, I think, you know, yeah. I mean, my sense, at least, is that, and I think the perception is probably accurate, is that if you had a full-fledged military operation in these areas, the likelihood of civilian casualties would be higher than if you relied solely on drone strikes. I think so. I think that's true, and I think that if you talk to people, and I know people have made this argument even in the context of talking about drones, and I think it might be from this Ariana poll or maybe some others. Christine Farrer comes to mind. I can't remember exactly, but people will say that, you know, if you talk to someone in Fatah, they much rather this drone strikes than a full-fledged military operation. And to an extent, I think you know, that sounds right. I have heard that from some people, so that resonates. But I mean, that's a rather like, I don't know. It's a rather horrible choice to be asking people to make, right? You know, and rather unfair choice. You know, I mean, because you'd rather the drone strikes because your chances are, you know, whatever, like X minus, you know, whatever, you know, 20 minus X percentage versus 20%. I mean, that's not really an argument. I mean, no one in that position is gonna be, you know, full-heartedly behind that latter strategy. It's the best of two awful options to that person, right? That being said, I do think that the conventional wisdom is that if people did go in, the casualties would be higher. The problem with all of this is that I think the reality is that drones aren't, even from a security perspective, aren't the answer to militancy in these areas, right? So I think the United States is using this because it's the only tool it has in its bag right now. The Pakistanis won't go into North Waziristan at this point in time, at least, and so they're relying on what they have and scaling it up, because also I think prospectively they don't expect the Pakistanis to go in there anytime soon. Mechanisms for compensation. I think it depends, right? So I think for us, from an advocacy perspective, it's easiest to work with what exists already. So as you know, as I mentioned, the Pakistani government does have mechanisms in place. There's a lot of problems with those, but I think the first step is to, you know, do what we've done, which is to examine those, see what the gaps are, see what the problems are, how they're administered, how they're funded and financed, and find ways to improve those, and then talk with the Pakistanis about how to do that, as well as other interlocutors with the international community in the United States and how to support those efforts. What those mechanisms look like on the ground is it's on the civilian side of government, so it's not by the military. It's by, you know, let's say it's by local level administrators in, like, let's say SWAT. So you have a district official who's in charge of SWAT called the DCO, the District Coordinating Officer. And he will compile lists of dead and injured and go out and collect that information and verify it, and then provide cash compensation to those people. And I think that, you know, from our perspective at least, that seems like a pretty prudent way to go about things. Again, lots of problems with how it's working in practice, but you work with what exists there, and there's a lot of opportunities for real change, I think. Advocacy side. So I'll say something first about the Pakistani side of things. I think that that's something that's often missing from the conversation, is that as opposed to Afghanistan, where you have a relatively weak state and you have ISAF and others in that region calling the shots, in Pakistan you have a much stronger state. And so I think, and civil society as well, and a much more sophisticated one at that. And so I think that requires engaging on the domestic Pakistani side a lot. And so I think without that piece being there, it's difficult to move forward. It's not just about talking to the right people at state or DOD, et cetera, on the U.S. side. I think you very much need Pakistani side as well. And so in our experience, I would say, you know, I worked with Pakistani civil society for this report. I worked with, you know, human rights organizations as well as local NGOs who are working on the ground, implementing projects, et cetera. When I return to Pakistan in a couple weeks, we'll be working with an NGO there, setting up policy dialogues with parliamentarians, local and federal level, to try to talk about compensation issues, raise our concerns, talk about our recommendations, etc. And then also trying to engage the Pakistani media, because that's an important part of that advocacy strategy as well. And on the U.S. side, I think, I think we're just, I think this report is a first step in many ways. This isn't an issue that's been talked about a lot. So I think, what we want to do is put down some, good evidence, interviews, etc., of what's going on the ground, and then use that as a way to create put forward a conversation about these issues, and then we'll be in a better position to advocate.
Just a point of information about the question about the U.S. military, the Pakistani military versus the U.S. In our poll, we found if you ask the question, who would you like to go after, Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, 70% of FATA residents said the Pakistani military alone without any other help. So, and the Pakistani, the most popular person in FATA is Army Chief of Staff Kiani by a very long shot. So the Pakistani military, and in fact, FATA residents, when asked what kind of government would you like, chose the Pakistani military as the government of choice. It's kind of a little bit of a surprising answer.
Yes.
Go ahead.
My name is Dilawar Jan. I'm a journalist from Pakistan, and I have covered violence in Swat and Malakand area. I've just come here 3 months back. My question, I'm just I don't know what period of the civilian casualties you mentioned, 2,100 civilian casualties. I don't know what is the time period of that casualties, because when I see this report is much softer as compared to the ground reality. In Swat alone, I'm talking about official figures. Last time when I was coming here, it was around 1,600 in Swat alone. So I'm wondering, there are operations in more than 10 districts, like FATA agencies and districts. So I'm wondering that, what are the sources of this survey, or what do you say to it? Number 2, you just said about compensation that is mitigating anger there. It might be true, but particularly in case of Swat, where military has destroyed more than 8,000 houses, and one house, you were there, that the houses are very big there in Pakistan, and they cost millions of rupees. So the military is only, or the government is only giving them 400,000 rupees. Equally, this is uniform compensation. So the anger is still there. The people say that we voluntarily left our houses, allowed the military to come in and purge the area of militants. And in the process, they destroyed our houses. We suffered casualties also, and we lost our business, jobs, everything.
Okay, I think we get the question. Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So on sources and time period, so the figure of I believe is just over 2,100. That's just from terrorism. So I know the arithmetic can be a little convoluted sometimes, but that's kind of a function of the fact that we don't know a lot of the numbers, right? So 2,100 or thereabouts is an estimate from a Pakistani think tank.
Is that PIPS?
Yes, that's right, yeah. PIPS, and that's their estimate for civilian casualties from terrorism in 2009. U.S. National Counterterrorism Center, I believe, puts it at over 2,600, so even greater than that, again, from terrorism alone. So none of those take into consideration Pakistani military operations, drone strikes, etc., right? So you're precisely right, that if you consider all the civilian casualties that were incurred in places such as Swat and elsewhere, that figure must be much higher. And I think the SWAT example is disturbing, and we have some of the numbers that you mentioned there that we got from officials in SWAT, and I believe it was, pre-April 09, so far that year or in the previous couple months, they had about between 700 and 800 casualties, and then April 09 until I spoke to them in early 2010, another 800 or so. So similar to what you just described, which is a huge number, and only in SWAT, one district, right? And so I think we deduce 2 things from that. Number 1, the overall casualties are much higher than in Afghanistan, as I mentioned. Number two, if that's the kind of civilian casualties that are going on in an area that has ostensibly been largely vacated of civilians during a major military operation, and actually has people on the ground who can try to assess civilian casualties, what's going on in areas in Fata where we don't really know what's going on the ground, and have much less of a sense of who's there and who's left than in SWAT. So I think that's rather disturbing to sort of consider and think about, and that's what we're trying to raise attention to. On the compensation issue, specifically on the housing, I think that's a good point. You know, these amounts are, you know, difficult, and I actually think in property damage, it's even more of a problem than in deaths and injuries sometimes, because the deaths and injuries, I mean, you know, people, you know, they offer quite sizable sums relative to most people's incomes, but of course, no one's thinking about it in terms of, you know, X to X, right? In those contexts, you know, something's being offered, it can help them, it's recognizing their loss, it's often associated with a gesture, dignifying gestures, etc. In the case of property compensation, it's sometimes more difficult, I think, to mitigate anger, because someone knows how much their house is worth, right? And if you've given me 5% of that value, I mean, that does very little to sort of, you know, mitigate that loss. So, you know, I think in reality, there's financial constraints on the part of the Pakistani government and even the United States, who's primarily funding the housing compensation. They can't provide a new house for every single person whose house was destroyed. When it comes to relative values, I think that's also an administrative issue. You know, I know the guys who did all the surveying for the housing compensation, and this was just like a nightmare to do, to go out to houses in these areas, many of which are still somewhat dangerous, and try to conduct these surveys and assess how much damage there was and whether it was actually from the conflict or not, etc. And to add another layer to that being how to assess the property value of the house as well, and incorporate that into the calculus, I think is quite difficult. I mean, that's something we have large problems with ourselves here, never mind in SWAT. And so I think that was a major consideration in the housing context. But I definitely do recognize the point, especially in the context of property, that getting compensation to match people's expectations can be a real challenge.
Wajahat Ali, who is actually are you on the board of PIPS or a member? Yeah.
Thank you. My question is about the drone attacks. We all know that the Pakistani government has often maintained that these attacks are counterproductive, but Pakistan has also pointed out that probably the United States of America should give this technology to Pakistan so that Pakistan can operate these drones and use them to fight against the insurgents in the northwestern territories of the country. Do you think that if that happens, it is going to minimize the outrage over the civilian casualties that are taking place due to the drone attacks? Because it seems to me that it's not just about civilian casualties when it comes to drone attacks, it's also about the sovereignty issue that we are facing.
I think, well, firstly on the sovereignty issue, which a lot is made of, particularly in Pakistan, I think when it comes to, and as Peter mentioned, I'm a lawyer, so sovereignty, I think of law, and I think of something very formalistic in that sense, and so I have to get in my 2 cents there, which is that effectively there's no sovereignty issue in Pakistan, right? I mean, everyone knows that they're not only consenting, but they're cooperating. So as a legal matter, there really isn't a sovereignty issue. As a political matter, that's a different story, which is, I gather, what you're getting at. I think, well, actually, as the New America Foundation poll alluded to or indicated, people's opinions do change depending on who is conducting the strikes, which makes sense. And so I think that's exactly right, that you can't point to the fact that this is only about civilian casualties and that's what's motivating people. It's a sense that someone else is doing this to us. Who are they to do this to us? I think to take that a little further, I think the one question is, do we think, if the Pakistanis were actually conducting all these strikes themselves, would this be better, both from a humanitarian as well as strategic perspective? And that's an open question. That's a complicated question. I mean, I don't really believe that the Pakistanis offered this in good faith. I think that this was a bargaining chip in negotiations at a time in which, there were a lot of negotiations going on, particularly over North Waziristan and continuing operations in South Waziristan. So I think that was why it was introduced at that juncture. There's also a lot of larger geopolitical reasons as to why the drone technology transfer would be very problematic with India and the United States and all this stuff, right? So, but all that aside, I mean, I think, look, when it comes to drones, I'm not pro-drone or anti-drone, right? I mean, drones are a weapon. I mean, you're not pro-cruise missile or anti-cruise missile or pro-battleship or anti-battleship, right? These things can all be used and abused in a variety of ways. So given that, you have to think about, all right, now if the Pakistanis have this capability in their hands, what is the potential for abuse? How much will we know about it? Will any of those concerns that we have now be allayed or improved? I would venture to say no. I think that, as covert and as frustrating as the U.S. intelligence and military is on these issues, the Pakistanis would probably be, a great deal tougher in this respect. On the other hand, you could imagine, a sense that at least if they went that direction, there'd be ownership of it, right? Pakistanis would be involved. If Pakistani journalists got a hold of a civilian casualty somewhere in a horrible story or something like this, they're on the hook for it. It's their responsibility. So when it comes to actually addressing civilian casualties and minimizing those things, I think ownership is really important. So I think there would be potential in that sense if the Pakistanis had the technology.
Well, you can imagine a situation where you don't transfer technology, but you just give the Pakistanis more responsibility for the targeting, and you do that in a more transparent way, right?
If it was public as well, right? I mean, if the Pakistanis
would also have to take ownership, which
exactly.
Right now they probably don't want to.
Exactly.
Hi, Fred Kaplan with Slate and New America. Can somebody explain what is the Pakistani drone program? I mean, is there really one? I mean, the U.S. drones, these are called unmanned aerial vehicles, which is a little misleading because back in the base in Nevada, there are at least 12 personnel constantly working on any flight, from the people piloting the joystick to intelligence officials looking at the data. This is a very complicated thing. If somebody could say, okay, I'm a Pakistani, I'm picking the target, that's really about all they could do, I think. Which leads to a second point. Why doesn't somebody just say, okay, that attack, that was a Pakistani drone that was, nobody would know the difference. These things are invisible. The biggest of these drones could be rolled into this room, without any problem at all. So, but does anybody here know just what the Pakistani drone program consists of, and whether they have any capability to really get into the targeting and operation of these things?
You mean independent of what the United States might offer them?
Well, as far as I know, the drones, as we understand them, is pretty much a U.S.
kind
program.
of a rudimentary drone program. I think the Herald magazine has written about it in one of the newsline. So
what does it consist of? Rudimentary is, they make the planes, or they bought the planes, or.
But it wouldn't be something that. Sorry.
Yeah, explain it.
The Pakistani drones that cannot carry weapons.
Yeah,
they
exactly.
cannot strike attacks.
Yeah.
They are just for spying and these things.
Yeah,
and
surveillance.
Their flight duration is very small.
Yeah.
Like you said, 3 hours, 4 hours,
Yeah.
and these are small, so these are not effective.
Well, by contrast, a lot of American drones can stay afloat for 25 hours at a time and are armed. And,
Yeah, exactly. The arming is pretty.
It's a totally different thing.
Yeah, exactly. The arming capability of U.S. drones is obviously one of the. That's the important distinction in that respect, right? I'd imagine that if you just you would just sort of look at what the United States have now, rewind 10 to 20 years, and look at that beginning technology, and I'd imagine that that's what you have in Pakistan. Also, the fact that they're asking for the kinds of hardware from the United States that they are suggests that this would obviously be a real improvement in their capability.
Andrew Bingham here. I was just wondering if you saw any quote-unquote radicalization in the victims that you were speaking with, where there was none before, after drone attacks, or just to the drone attacks in general, and if you got any feeling or sense of that while you were there.
Sure, yeah. Well, first, I think on a methodological sort of note, that's not really something that we focused on. I think it's also very difficult to get that kind of information from someone, especially when you're talking about a small sample size and very sensitive area and sensitive information. More generally, I guess, which is where I think the question is pointing, is that I guess I tend to sort of push back a little bit on the idea that, someone loses their brother or father or something in a drone strike or an artillery strike or an airstrike or something, and then the reaction is, an embrace of radicalism and picking up a gun and joining the militants. It's not to say that, cumulatively that there could be an effect going on in that way, but, you talk to people, people are complicated and their reasons for joining militancy can be complex, and how people internalize and understand why what's happened to them is complex. And I'm not sure that there's this obvious one-to-one correlation of, this happened to me, now I'm going to go fight. I think that, well, firstly, that can certainly happen. There are other factors, other effects that need to be considered. So I mentioned a little earlier these sort of what I call the second order sort of effects. The idea that if strikes are going on in a particular area, it's very difficult for the Pakistani government to operate there. I know people who work with U.S. government finance projects, which are basically the only projects going on developmentally in FATA. And, if you have a strike somewhere, they can't get back into that area. It's tougher to get local leaders, local tribal elders to sign on to projects to cooperate. It creates a level of fear and paranoia on the part of militants that is often taken out on the local populace, accusing people of spying, very brutal tactics against people, forcing people to take sides in a way that increase the costs of finding local buy-in when you're the Pakistani state or the U.S. government through them trying to do development and governance in those areas. And so I think that the radicalization is certainly there to an extent, and also on a rhetorical level too, right? I think that we shouldn't underestimate that there's a propaganda gain that isn't directly from the victim to militancy, but that there's a rhetorical gain there as well. But I think there's important second-order effects there to consider.
Well, explain to us the methodology that you employed. You were doing these interviews in some of the more hostile anti-Western areas in the world, and you're obviously not a Pashtun tribesman. So how did you go about this?
Yeah, sure. The thing that a lot of Pakistanis say is, for a lot of Americans at least, dark hair, you put them in shalwar kameez, and maybe you can pass every once in a while. So I kind of relied on that in some cases. But no, first of all, that was one of the really big challenges for a number of reasons. FATA is inaccessible to all foreigners, effectively, and even to Pakistanis, it's incredibly difficult to access. So we relied primarily, with respect to victims from FATA, most of the people we spoke to were displaced. So either in areas around FATA, places called Hangu Kohat, which is where Orakzai and Kuram agencies, a lot of the displaced there have come. In South Waziristan, it would be Tank and Diyar Khan. Even access to those areas can be very restricted and difficult, and something you have to work with the government quite extensively on, but you can get there. And then areas of SWAT, those are a little bit more accessible. Again, you still have to work with the government to get clearances and so forth to get in. But they are accessible. And I guess, I relied on a couple of things, I guess. Firstly, keeping, as low a profile as possible. I think many people in these areas are used to people traveling in large convoys and guards or, bulletproof SUVs and things like this, and I relied on predictability and dressing, locally and working only with Pathans, with Pashtuns. Also wherever I was, identifying victims was quite a challenge also, and so we relied, always on local NGOs who were on the ground there, distributing aid, working on counseling centers, working with women and so forth, which is a good avenue into these communities, and so. It was, I think, working on and relying a lot on local NGOs and those networks and connections to get information and be able to maneuver around in a safe way.
Kawar, who I believe is a native of FATA, he's behind you.
Khawarzi from Pakistan. Well, understanding of this whole conflict, that is insurgency and there is not a uniform force which is fighting or being targeted by the military, both sides of the border. What is the criteria, especially in FATA where access is so difficult or maybe impossible? What is the criteria of civilian and militant? Well, our sources are very, selected sources. Either it is coming from a district administration, or Taliban, or insurgent, whatever you call them, or some locals. But there is no source of independent, in fact, access in that area. So where you draw the line? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is a huge issue, but it's and you touched on both these aspects. But I think there's two aspects in which this is a problem. First of all, getting independent information, good information, credible information, and secondly, as a more almost abstract idea, where that line is drawn. And so I think to speak to the latter, because it's difficult to do the former without knowing. I mean, even if you have good information, if no one can agree on what the definition or distinction is, you're without a really important critical starting point, right? So I think that the issue of who is a civilian, I mean, essentially, who is a non-combatant really, and a combatant in this context is a huge issue, and it comes up, and I think, well, it comes up obviously in the context of after an airstrike, how do you separate, was that person a militant, or separate basically the dead or something along these lines. But to highlight two areas in which it's very, very problematic. Number one is obviously drone strikes, right? So there has to be, or one would hope that there is some legal basis, some legal definition of this distinction that's operative and functional by the United States government. We don't know what that is. We don't know if the Pakistanis who sign on to it have any involvement in it, or even know what it is themselves. Right? So that's a really big problem. I also tend to believe that definition is likely wider than most people would find acceptable. There's been evidence of the kind of targeting that's gone on in Afghanistan that suggested persons such as drug lords were being considered as targetable as combatants, which I would argue under international law is not permissible. Particularly in areas where cultural practices are such that and the terrain and so forth, and the way people live, it's very difficult to actually distinguish between, who's providing what to people. And this tendency, which in talking to Pakistani officials, there seems to be not very much sensitivity to. But if you provide housing or food or sustenance to a fighter, that does not make you a combatant. Right? I think in the eyes of many, there is a logic there that you are now part of the militancy. If that's, you've chosen a side and that's what you've done. I mean, this is clearly unacceptable, right? I mean, we would never imagine, to flip it around, that the wife or family of the drone operator, wherever he might be in the United States, could be legally targeted as providing support, material support to that person as a combatant. So that's just an unacceptable standard, and we have to be clear that that it's a standard and it has to apply everywhere equally and uniformly. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. Info and independent. I'm sorry. The other context in which it becomes important is in detention, right? This is also something that isn't talked about, I think, enough in the context of Pakistan and internationally, is that there are thousands of militants or suspected militants being held in Pakistan at the moment. Not clear what they're going to do with them. Not clear, how they're going to be tried or reviewed administratively, etc. And so they're coming actually up against the same sort of legal problems that we in the United States have in the context of detention, which is in some respects a first-order question of who counts as a militant and a combatant, someone who we can detain, try, and punish, versus someone whom should be immune from that. And so that's a serious question, and it's something that doesn't exist there only, but in a lot of different circles and places. And so it's very difficult to move forward without resolution on that. And on the independent information in those areas, I mean, that's just, unfortunately, that's the nature, particularly of FATA at the moment. It's just incredibly difficult to get access and information. But I will say that, having spoken with people who are, doing similar work, again, it's tough to know. I mean, I didn't myself go to North Waziristan, but we had an interviewer who went to North Waziristan to conduct these interviews with drone victims. and that that entailed certain risks and so forth. But I did also think that it demonstrated that there are some possibilities of accessing these areas if you know the right people, if you have trust with the right people, if you're able to get in. So, and you can also access, a lot of people who lived in these areas who now are displaced, in these camps and in Peshawar, et cetera. And those are also very good sources of information. So as much as Fatah can be a black hole, there's also, some light shining through you can find.
My question was also included
Yeah.
those several incidents where we know the right number of people who were killed, but we don't see all those bodies. Say like 20 people killed and we see only 13 bodies. So this is always a question where those 7 bodies are gone. And in majority cases, we don't know. So this was one part of my concern, that if this kind of cases are included in your consideration when you were writing the report.
Yeah, I think in those cases, it's just, it's very difficult to know what's happened, particularly in case to case. So you have to work with the best information you have, and then deduce what you can from that information. And yeah, it's the best you can do. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Thank you. India Growth. My question is that what did you find out as far as U.S. image in Pakistan is concerned? Now, 2 things are now there. 1, strikes. 2nd, the aid. And finally, what U.S. is saying that many militants are being hidden within the civilians. So what is the best way to bring those militants or Al-Qaeda out of the civilians so no civilians' death will take place?
Yeah, absolutely. Excuse me. So I think the U.S. image in Pakistan is, not very healthy at the moment. And it's tough to see, how that's going to change anytime in the near future. I think, on strikes, obviously, they're conducting strikes and not owning up to it. That kind of makes sense why people think the way that they do in some respect. So obviously very negative on strikes. And then with respect to aid, I think it's, the floods could have changed some of this, I think. Particularly because a lot of the aid is going into areas that haven't really been a part of this conflict in Sindh and Punjab. So I think time will tell whether or not these aid investments into these areas have changed perceptions of the United States. I think, just sort of off the top of my head, something I've been hearing a lot about is, sort of on the blogs and the media sphere, et cetera, of conspiracy theories around the floods and so forth, which certainly I think exists to an extent. But I think it's also important to give it time. And the vast majority of Pakistanis do not blog, and they are not, engaging in that element of the part of the society that we see. So who knows what, the average person or farmer in Punjab or Sindh thinks of the U.S. in, a year or two. So we'll have to see. But I do know in conflict areas, it's very, very difficult for the United States to operate there. In Fatah, it's impossible, obviously. They work through the optics of the Fatah Secretariat primarily, and then even then through an implementing partner. So their image is not very strong. It's not very positive there. But one final point on that is just that I do think that what's important to keep in mind is that winning from a U.S. strategic perspective, I'm not sure that winning hearts and minds to vis-a-vis the United States is, number one, a realistic, or number two, really that significant of a goal. If you count Pakistan and its government as an ally, then what's important is ensuring that its own population sees that as a legitimate force in these areas.
Just a quick comment on that. Unfavorable views of the United States have really been very stable. Only 20% of Pakistanis have a favorable view of the United States, and this goes back in a long time before the drone strikes. Only 9% of Pakistanis have a favorable view of the drones, so certainly the drones are part of that unfavorable. But this long preceded anti-Americanism is a kind of pretty routine thing in Pakistan. But I think I want to endorse what Chris says. the Taliban and Al-Qaeda are losing the war of ideas in Pakistan, not because the United States is winning it, which would have been is always a very naive kind of view that we should win the war of ideas, because they're losing it. I mean, support for suicide bombings dropped from 33% to 5% in Pakistan in the last several years. Support for bin Laden, which used to be at 65%, is down to 16%. Support for the Taliban, which enjoyed a sort of religious Robin Hood image for a long time, has totally cratered. And as a result of which, if you look at the military operations in Swat and Waziristan that Chris has alluded to, they're done with quite a lot of Pakistani popular support. Previous operations in these areas in 2005 and 2006 were sort of seen as essentially we're just doing America's bidding. But the Pakistani military operation in southern Waziristan in October of 2009 was a large-scale operation, 30,000 Pakistani troops, serious blocking positions, was done quite effectively and quite realistically, and it was done with at least half the population of the Pakistani population supported this operation, whereas previously such operations were done with very little support. So that's a big change.
Absolutely.
Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Rob Dubois. I'm a security advisor. You mentioned the duplicity of the Pakistani government. I think that that's a huge factor in this whole discussion. It's pragmatic. It's essential that they're duplicitous, because if they're shown to be complicit with America, who is at the 80% hated level, then the regime itself or the administration stands to be overthrown in a cascading sort of effect, which would put Pakistan into a worse situation, and thus our best interest in a worse situation. What do you think? I mean, you've been over there examining this, not at a political level necessarily, but what do you think about that requirement to satisfy both sides?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I'm sure that that's on some level, or whoever's at the end of the day making this decision, to a degree, that's the calculus, is that by maintaining this duplicity with respect to the drone program, we distance ourselves in a politically necessary way. But I mean, I guess I just don't buy that. I mean, it's I mean, it's not like this is the only area of cooperation of the United States and Pakistan, right? I mean, it's like in the amount of aid, and I mean, they're allies, right? I mean, they're meeting all the time. I mean, there's no secret, right? It's not as if for the rest of the time they're enemies, but they cooperate on drones, and we don't want that to get out. No, it's quite the opposite. It's like they're on board with like 99% of the things that they do, yet this like small little sliver of policy they somehow think is radioactive and they won't touch. And so yeah, I mean, I actually think that the costs of being transparent and and being clear and taking ownership over the drones is not that high. I think there's a number of very specific reasons on political and probably bureaucratic levels as to why it's not going forward. But yeah, I mean, I don't see that duplicity as necessary because because it's really required for Pakistani regime stability.
Also, I would sort of push back against the word duplicity. I mean, I think that the Pakistani government Pakistani's got a long memory of our relationship with them. And, we sort of exploited them pretty effectively during the war against the Afghans, and then, saddled them with the Pressler Amendment and kind of washed our hands of our relationship. So they see us as fair weather friends as much as we may see them as doing things that aren't exactly in our interest. And it's also very naive to think that any country is going to act in our interests, and they're going to have their own interests. And so I think on the positive side, let's step back, zoom out just a couple of, from this, and sort of see that right now our interests and the Pakistani interests are much more closely aligned, I think, than any time since the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 1979. I mean, I think the Pakistani government, military, and population have largely turned against the Taliban. Yes, there are hiccups like the NATO convoy, but we're in a very different situation than we were even 3 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. And just on the duplicitous point, I mean, I do think that I was speaking with someone earlier about this, and they pointed out that the Pakistani government has been giving a little bit more in terms of admitting some involvement in the drone strikes. I mean, this is all semantics and rhetoric and language, but it has moved in that direction ever so slightly. But just to comment quickly on what Peter just mentioned as well as before about the operations, I think it's interesting that Pakistani support within the public has changed in that time. But it seems to me, interestingly enough, largely because of internal dynamics within Pakistan, right? I mean, the operation in SWAT, and when people saw SWAT being taken over, and the YouTube video and these things coming out, and people's identification with SWAT as part of settled Pakistan as somewhere that they felt had been violated, that provoked, I think, a response on the part of the Pakistani population. And on the drone strikes issue, I do think that things have changed as well since Batullah Masood's assassination, in the sense that the U.S. drone strikes no longer are this completely exterior, external thing going on without any respect for what's going on in our country and our agenda. The reality is that it's taking out a lot of people whom the Pakistanis now consider to be their enemies within the TTP, etc., persons who are conducting suicide bombings within their own country. And so I think that has prefaced a change in dynamicism in the part of the Pakistani population.
Jessica Ramirez, CNAS. I just wanted to follow up on a question that was asked earlier. How do you address militants who are hiding in civilian populations?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I voted it for good reason. Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously that's a very difficult question. I'm also not a military expert. I'm not, a coin or a tactical expert in that respect. So I won't, stray too far from what I guess I could responsibly say.
Can I add something to that, which is, as part of your calculus, Bayatullah Masood was responsible for the death of literally hundreds or arguably thousands of Pakistani civilians. So that, there is a kind of cost-benefit analysis here as well. His wife was killed in the attack, who was obviously non-competent, but he himself was responsible for so much carnage.
Yeah. Sorry, let me just... okay, so in terms of the best strategy when it comes to these incredibly complicated circumstances in which militants are hiding amongst the civilian population, again, I don't want to speak to specifically the kind of tactics that would be involved there, but there are tactics that have been developed. The U.S. military obviously has been very involved in developing and honing these tactics. There's been a lot of efforts, within the U.S. military to try to share these strategies and tactics with the Pakistanis in training, etc. And so, there are tools we have to fight those kinds of wars where there are strategies for minimizing civilian casualties, even in those difficult situations. So I think in light of that, the imperative is twofold. Firstly, learn how to do that. Learn what the tactics are that are out there. And a lot of it is not complicated technology, but it's tactics and officers and people on the ground and soldiers on the ground knowing how to do that, not behaving in a way that's, training to, fight large land combat with the Indian military. Secondly, the reality, and this is something that I think CIVIC recognizes up front, is that civilians die in war, and that's an unfortunate and necessary reality of the world. Our question is, what do you do about that? And so our answer to that is you provide them, firstly, with some recognition, acknowledgement of the harm that they've suffered, and then you provide them with tangible assistance, help in recovering. We think that that's something that civilians in these situations generally demand and expect from people whom are responsible for harming them. And we think it's within the power and responsibility of those generally responsible, the warring parties. So, yeah. Oh, wait, and so on the Batullah Masood example, certainly proportionality is a consideration when conducting strikes of this kind, and not to get too sort of technical or formalistic about the example, but I do think it's important. Now, let's say Batullah Masood had given up, right? He's shown a white flag. I've changed my ways. I've become, an agnostic Buddhist, and and I'm no longer a combatant, and I'm no longer a threat to anyone. I think in that circumstance, it actually would not be permissible to target him, regardless of what he had done previously. Strikes and killing people are not punitive measures. They're not substitutes for law enforcement, arrests, punishments, judicial processes. They're things that are intended and permissible uses of force because we feel like the person presents a real threat to others. So now I think it's arguable that really wasn't the case. So I think the argument there about Batullah Masood getting the massage with his wife is not what he's done in the past, but what does that past tell you about what he's capable of in the future? And if there's a civilian caught in that strike, is that proportionally worth it, given what we know he is capable of and intent on doing? In that case, it might not be, but it's not my job to do that proportionality calculation. I think that that's the job of the military, and that's the job of them to say and defend that.
Chris, let me ask you, as a Harvard Law School graduate who specialized in human rights, one of the things that I think is not much discussed in this drone issue is that let's take it as a fact that the civilian casualty rate is pretty low, which I think is true, and also that the actual number of leaders who are being killed in these attacks is actually also very low.
Yeah.
And so the vast majority of people who are being killed are lower level militants. I would say something in the 90% range.
Yeah.
We have Harold Coe, we know what Harold Coe has sort of said about the drones. I mean, as a lawyer, how legitimate is it to be killing a large number of lower level militants who certainly don't pose any imminent threat to the United States by any stretch? Can you just sort of reflect on that, and why hasn't it been part of the discussion? Is it irrelevant, or is it something that has sort of we've been too focused on the civilian casualty issue?
Yeah. So I think firstly it's a really important point. I think one part of the reason why it hasn't been more focused on is that the strategy of the strikes has changed in the last couple of years, right? It began as a very targeted assassination program of high-value targets. You go back, before 2-3 years ago, and these things were incredibly, incredibly rare. As time went on, they slowly increased, and then clearly there was a jump, right? And I think basically at some level there was the belief that this isn't just about taking out high-value targets. This is about disrupting militant actions, operations, meetings, etc., capacity to carry out operations. Basically treating the battlefield or treating that area like any other battlefield. And I think, firstly, that hasn't been sufficiently appreciated by people because of the drone strikes history, and then the assumption and the publicity around high-value targets, and the idea that you go after people on a target list, right? There's a target list, and that deserves a lot of focus, but again, let's not forget that most people killed are not on a target list, and they're being targeted based on pattern of life analysis, other informants and networks. We don't know the names of the vast majority of people who are being killed or even targeted. From a legal perspective, it's problematic because, what kind of information do you have to make these distinctions responsibly? When you don't have troops on the ground, when the Pakistani government really doesn't have any substantial presence in the area. Now, I presume that there are informant networks that are being run out of Afghanistan by CIA and special ops, and I presume that the ISI is sharing and other intelligence agencies are sharing what their informants in these areas tell the United States. And those assets, I think, actually because the civilian casualties could be much higher, suggest that the assets actually are of a pretty decent value, considering the terrain and circumstances. But that also doesn't mean that a lot of mistakes aren't made. And again, in an environment where information is very scarce and very questionable, and you don't have people on the ground, I think that presents real doubt as to whether or not you're making the distinction from a legal perspective in a responsible way. The other thing I'd just like to say there is that there's actually a lot of legal problems with the drone strikes, and I think, again, sovereignty is actually the least of all of them. I think, for instance, something I think that a lot of people haven't talked about is even if the Pakistani government has consented to the United States conducting drone strikes on its territory, that's not the end of the conversation, right? The Pakistani government can only consent to those actions which it itself could take. Yeah? So what if there are militant groups, perhaps like the Haqqanis, who the Pakistani government really actually isn't in open armed conflict with. How can they, the United States from a legal perspective, or excuse me, the Pakistanis from a legal perspective, consent to the United States killing those persons within their own territory? The metaphor I would use, or the comparison I would use is, it would be as if the United States, because it didn't have the intelligence to track down, a Mexican drug lord in Los Angeles, said to the Mexican Army or Air Force or whatnot, if you want to come in and take care of this for us, come on in. I mean, obviously you can't do that. I mean, and that's absurd, right? And so I think that there are, legal complexities associated with this area that haven't been fully explored, especially because it's not Afghanistan. It's not clearly a battleground in the same way that area is. And if it is, the United States needs to come clean. They need to explain, right? That's the bottom line. They need to define, what they consider the space to be, what the boundaries of that space are, and more importantly, what the boundaries they see are the types of actions that they take in Pakistan. How far does that go, right? So if you target low-level militants in North Waziristan, does that mean you can do the same thing in Yemen? Does that mean you can do the same thing elsewhere in the world? Because certainly that's the direction it's gone in targeting high-value targets. Now, how far does that argument extend? And so I think that's very problematic and worrying legally.
Okay. This final question, thanks. We'll just take two questions together and then we'll wrap up.
I had a question about, Cindy Rakab from German Marshall Fund. My question is, how does the U.S. and Pakistani government compensation for people's loss compare to compensation and services provided by the radical groups that have been working in these areas for a very long time? And who do most of the interviewees that you talk to blame their loss on? Do they point to certain instigators of the conflict?
Great. And then one over here.
My question, and my name is Susan Wynn. My question is, under what authority at the moment is the United States government operating its operations in Pakistan?
So I'll begin with the second question. Do you mean, well, I guess maybe I'd ask, do you mean domestic authority or authority in Pakistan?
Domestic authority. We're there with our drones.
Congressionally, it's the authorization for the use of military force, right?
Okay. Oh, do you mean the use of drones then? Or do you mean like a soldier in the embassy? Okay, drones. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. All right. Okay, that's all right. Okay. All right. Yeah. Who says they can drop those things? Well, I think, I think at this point, we've got Harold Koh's say-so that it exists. I think generally, it would be considered to be within the AUMF, right? It's seen as an extension of the Afghan theater of war and congressionally authorized post 9/11. I think that, personally, I think that I find that somewhat persuasive in the sense that so many operationally of what's going on in Afghanistan is originating from that area of Pakistan. But again, I think that it's very important to be explicit about what links actually exist and using that as a basis for extension of the AUMF. I think you get into much more difficult terrain when you think about whether the AUMF authorizes use of force in Yemen or Somalia or wherever, right? Exactly. You don't know. And so, but I think, the first step is to get the administration to it's not just about admitting the drone attacks. It's explaining the justification. It's justifying why. How do they justify what's going on? That's the first step to accountability and knowing where they see the boundaries are. And I'm not sure, to be perfectly honest, the administration even knows exactly what it thinks about these things at this point. And you can see these debates going on in the detention context. So I think, they're sort of hedging, because they might stand to lose when they come up publicly with some of these things. But I think the other problem too is that they inherited some really complicated legal policies from the Bush era and didn't really anticipate the complications legally of conducting the kind of war they want to conduct.
Can I ask you a quick question on that?
Go ahead,
because why just do the thought experiment where the Bush administration was still in power and the drone strikes were at their present level. Do you think the human rights community would be pushing back more against it if it was a Bush thing?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I think that's probably likely. I do think one of the obstacles to pushing back on it, though, is precisely what we've been talking about, is that it's actually not clear. I mean, even if you sit down with a bunch of international human rights and international law experts, you put them all in a room and you talk to them about drones, they don't agree on things. Even basic questions like distinction, it's not clear. Now, that doesn't mean you can't go forward with saying to the United States, we have, good authority on the ICRC that we know what the difference between a combatant and non-combatant is. What's your standard, right? So I think there's space to pose those questions, but I think one of the obstacles is that even within those advocacy communities, there are divisions and uncertainty. It was the last question? Yeah, it was the compensation, sorry, yeah. Yeah. I'm not very well. I'll say I never came across one instance of a militant group directly providing compensation to victims. Now, I think that there are instances of providing more generalized aid and assistance and so forth, particularly to fallen militants and combatants and their families. But in our work, we did not come across instances where militants were paying the kind of compensation that we're seeing the Pakistani government pay. And so I believe the second question was who do victims blame their losses on? Yeah. I think so. Certainly, in instances where someone has been targeted by the Taliban, they blame the Taliban on the militants, and it depends on the person and the instance. But I will say that one thing I think it was important to take away from it is that even in instances where people weren't sure why or how they were injured, even if they were opposing the Taliban and supported the military operations, once they were harmed, they saw it as the responsibility of the government and the military to do something, right? And it's, in some ways, I think this seems like somewhat of a sort of disadvantage on the part of the military, but, to quite the contrary. People expected things of the military and government because people held those powers to be legitimate. They were who you went to get answers, to get services, etc. And that's what it means to be a legitimate power in these areas in the eyes of people. And so I think providing compensation and addressing people's expectations when it comes to that is very key to legitimacy. And so, so I think that people, they blamed both warring parties, but they expected a lot, or what they should have expected from their own military and government. And I think that that's a very important finding in the report and hopefully a basis for our advocacy going forward.
Great. Well, we want to give Chris a round of applause. That was very stimulating.